cannot be surpassed. Now at that peak, which is about 50% of reserves being used up, you get this point when it's literally geophysically more difficult to extract petroleum. The petroleum is still there, 50% is still there. But geophysically, it becomes more difficult to get it out. So production starts to decline, inevitably after the 50% point, until the resource is finally depleted. Now what that graph shows is that it basically, you've got the purple boxes showing, basically indicating the oil reserve that are being discovered. Now, as we can see, since 1940 to 2000, the number of reserves that are being discovered is declining systematically. And the forecast for discoveries, in terms of extrapolating how much can be discovered, is pretty pessimistic. There's not very much at the moment that we can see coming on the line. If you look at the blue line going diagonally towards the top, that's basically rising rates of consumption, because you've got China, you've got India as well, who are industrializing very fast. Consumption is increasing. Now what happens is that peak oil means is that there'll come a point where the amount of consumption is not being met by the supply. And that is when you're going to hit this gigantic crisis, when you will not be able to continue to meet the needs of industrial civilization. The question is, of course, when is this going to happen? And there is a debate amongst oil industry experts. You've got the pessimists and you've got the optimists. Now, about 20 years ago, it was possible you had optimists who were basically saying that, don't worry, we've got so much oil left, that really we've got hundreds and hundreds of years, and obviously the pessimists were kind of saying, maybe we've got 20 to 30 years. Now the debate has kind of decreased, which kind of illustrates where we're at. The optimistic people basically say that, we've got about 30 years left. British Petroleum published a report a couple of months ago, basically optimistically saying that not to worry, we've got 30 years left. Now to me, 30 years is nothing to be optimistic about. 30 years is a pretty short period of time. But they were saying, 30 years, we've still got time, but okay, fair enough. Now the pessimists, and interestingly, the pessimists are now getting more and more support in the oil industry. Not necessarily amongst the big companies, but amongst the experts who are doing analysis. And what they're basically saying is that we've got about 4 years left. It's going to happen in about 2010. One of the big centres in London is the Association for the Study of Peak Oil. And they basically, they variably put the peak between 2000 and 2010. And a number of them kind of vary. Now what makes their work more credible is that some of their data derives from this database, which is held by this Geneva-based gigantic company called Petro Consultants. And the Petro Consultants database is the most comprehensive for data on oil resources outside North America. It's considered so significant that it's not in the public domain. In fact, it's priced at $32,000 a copy. So me and you are no way going to be able to afford it. Now, they basically, these two guys, Dr. Colin Campbell, who used to work for BP, by the way, and his colleague, they based their analysis on that data. That's the data that the oil companies are using to come up with their own statistics. Both of these crises, climate change and peak oil, are indelibly linked to the questions of food and water, as I mentioned. I mentioned food and water already. I want to talk about food scarcity in particular, just to illustrate how badly this is affecting us and how it's affecting us now. There's been a number of studies which have already talked about the link between climate change and food scarcity. The Met Office's Hadley Centre did a study that was funded by the government, actually. And they already said, millions of lives will be threatened as a result of climate change because of the inability to continue growing food due to drought. Again, a number of other studies have confirmed this. the most important thing I want to talk about is not just the question of climate change and peak oil. Of course, if the oil goes, then the modern agricultural system won't be able to sustain itself. If climate change becomes, continues out of control, again, the droughts will make it very, very difficult. What I'm pointing out is that on its own terms, the modern agribusiness industry, which is a hierarchical, corporate-dominated industry, it uses very, very intensive methods which are destructive of the environment, destructive of the soil. They don't have any respect for indigenous or traditional methods of agriculture, many of which have been developed over centuries. These methods are basically eroding the soil systematically and decreasing the fertility of the soil. As a result of this process, it's now known, a number of studies have shown, I mentioned this group called SAGE, who are operating out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison in America. They've done a study of how much land is being used, and pretty much all the fertile land is being used. There is not much land left, and the land that is being used is being exhausted. So we have a problem. So the problem here that I want to, is not so much the question of global population. It's the question of who is dominating the agribusiness industry and why are they using such devastating methods to produce food on a mass scale, rather than using other alternative, more ecologically sound methods. As a result of this, for the last 4 or 5 years, in fact more than that, since really the beginning of the new millennium, world grain production has basically been declining. It's been declining quietly as we speak. I just want to give you an example of how the mainstream media deals with this kind of stuff. It was about 3 weeks ago, I turned on the news. It was just morning news, maybe evening news, I can't remember. But the story was that Britons are going to have to pay more money to eat their fry-ups. That was the headline. It was kind of like a humor story. And they interviewed a lot of these kind of builder guys who were kind of in these cafes eating like egg and beans and toast and stuff, and bacon and all the rest of it, sausages, and they're like whoa, 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 and they were interviewing them. It was like, so how do you feel? That you're going to have to pay more money, for sausages and stuff. And they're like, well, I got to deal with it, innit? So like that was the response. Now, within that story, within about the space of 30 seconds, they mentioned that, by the way, the reason that this is happening is because world grain prices are rising. And what's happening is that the grain that they're feeding like cows and sheep and all the rest of it, because the farmers have to pay more for the grain to feed the animals, it's too much for them economically. So they're putting their prices up, basically. That's why it's happening. And so the issue of world grain prices rising, and why are they rising? They're rising because food production is actually declining. But that wasn't mentioned. That fundamental issue did not get mentioned. Look how the mainstream media frames these issues and trivializes them and almost eclipses them from public consciousness. It's really amazing. It's not a result of a grand conspiracy. It's the result of a combination of ignorance and people at the top who would much rather that the public doesn't really know what's going on. Finally, and I know you guys are getting tired,